Hey, welcome to Fundamentals of the Faith. I'm Pastor Matt here with Pastor Casey and John Davis. And we're going to dig into today the First Commandment because we're going to spend this first part of the fundamentals looking at the Ten Commandments. And so in order to look at the Ten Commandments, we should probably look at the First Commandment.
Number one's probably a good place to start.
Smart idea.
But, something to kind of keep in mind as we look at this is, the Ten Commandments, they aren't like a Lutheran thing. But rather they're a whole church thing. It's a Christianity thing. In fact, what you'll find is we're going to share how they're talked about in what was called the Small Catechism, which is a book that Luther wrote in order to train children and parents. And then also he wrote a bigger book called the Large Catechism. I know we'll never keep that straight, but
Wonder which one's big.
the Large Catechism to actually train clergy. In what that means. And so you'll hear us use quotes and stuff from that, but realize that these Ten Commandments aren't derived from Lutheran doctrine or any one vein of denomination in the church. They're actually from the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, but they first come to us in Exodus, and they've been a part of Jewish and Christian tradition throughout the history of Christianity and Judaism. So as we start sharing these, realize you're a part of a much bigger picture when you're diving through these things. So it doesn't matter whether you're Anglican, it doesn't matter whether you're Presbyterian, Lutheran, non-denominational, like these are all things that the Christian church as a whole has said these are important.
Yeah, and I think we even see, as we'll dig into them, that they have kind of a universal application, that they aren't just the kinds of things that make life go well in a small religious enclave. These are the kinds of things that make for a good life in any area.
Yeah, I like that thought because I think a lot of times we think about stuff like the Ten Commandments and we think they're really great and they work well in a vacuum, kind of like, in academic pondering. It works great in a vacuum of academia, but all of a sudden you get it out and it no longer works. But the reality is these commandments were built for real life, and they're actually things that can bless your life today, meaning they can make your life better than what it was, which is a really cool thing. So to kind of show you what we're talking about, we'll dig into the First Commandment. And the First Commandment is, you are to have no other gods. So Luther had a thing that he said in his, what is this, or what does this mean? So do you want to talk about really quick that whole, what does this mean with each of the commandments?
So the way Luther sets up the catechism is he will put out the main idea. In this case today, it's the First Commandment, and it's simply outlined, you shall have no other gods. And then he asks this question. We translate it in English as, what does this mean? But in German, when Luther first wrote it, it was, what is this? And I think that's a really, really great question to ask, because that's the first thing that comes to many of our minds when we're encountering something, especially something that might be new or unfamiliar to us. So think of this as Pastor Matt alluded to, this is a book that was written for children and their parents to learn the faith. So if you're not familiar with the faith, one of the first questions you're going to ask is, what is this?
He asked the question you're afraid to ask.
Yes, exactly.
Like, because you see that in people's eyes when they come up and you're like, oh yeah, the First Commandment is, have no other gods. And,
Cool,
what does
let's
that
do
mean?
it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
So Luther feeds you the question already, what does this mean? What is this? And he provides an answer. And how does he answer that?
Yeah, so what the Catechism would say in this is that we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. And then he goes into a lot of details about what does that mean to fear, love, trust in God above everything else. And the Catechism kind of gives a central thought about this, about the First Commandment. And it says this, it says, all people everywhere are constantly looking for happiness, identity, security, and meaning in life. And we look for those in all different places. And that's that central thought of what does it mean to have another God in your life?
Yeah, and I think that's really important because that just shows you how intensely practical, this First Commandment is. Because I don't think there's a person out there that I've ever encountered that's not asking themselves that question, that's not thinking that each and everything they do is going to help them pursue a better life. Everybody wants that security and meaning in their life. And so right out of the gate, the first thing that God says is, do you want that central security, that meaning, that fulfilled life that you're looking for? Have no other gods before me. And I think that's really interesting because it comes out of Exodus, like we talked about, in Exodus chapter 20, starting at verse 1. And I think it's really important to realize this because the Ten Commandments begin with a statement that God makes before he ever shares what you would call a commandment. And he says this, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me, is how he starts it. And then he goes on, he says, you shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in heaven or above, and that's on the earth beneath, and that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down or serve them, for I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generation to those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, that's a whole lot of things God's saying, but essentially what you need to hear is that first part. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slavery. And the reason that's so important is when we think of the Ten Commandments, we oftentimes think of the Ten Commandments as, here's my list of things I need to do in order that God will love me, so that God will love me, God will care for me, God will think I'm a good person. But really, the way God sets up the Ten Commandments are, you are already loved. You are already my child. You are already my people. I have already paid a great price to bring you out of this place where you're a slave and into this place where you're free and loved in me, in my family. So live like this.
Yeah, the context matters, doesn't it? Big time.
Yeah, it changes the whole landscape. Like I get so, I don't know. I get kind of sad personally when people kind of come up and they give me this sense like, oh, I'm just trying to do these things and I just want to know where I sit with God and I got to do these 10 commandments in order for God to love me. And I'm like, I think you missed the point. I think the point is God already loves you. He already cares for you. And so what he's trying to do is not just give you a list of things you do to please him, but rather he's giving you a list of things out of love that will help you figure out how life actually works the best.
Right, yeah, I think it's really helpful to reorient some of our perspective around the Ten Commandments and see them as more of a way of being than just a laundry list of things to do, boxes that we can check so that we can transactionally receive something from God. As you've already pointed out, we've received from God already. And now, as a result of what we've received, what does it look like simply to live or exist in that relationship with God that already is there?
That's huge. I think, too, we're throwing the word God around a lot.
Yeah.
And it gets really confusing because sometimes we're talking about God, big G, and God, little g. And you're going, okay, well, what's the difference? So big G God would be the one true God. So the God that is speaking to you in the Ten Commandments, the God that brings all of creation into existence, the only God that really exists. But there are other gods that were talked about. Not that they're real gods, but that's kind of the signifier, and that's why they're God, little g. So those are the idols that God's talking about, the little g gods. And so the question is, okay, well, what is a God, a little g God? And Luther has this to say in the Large Catechism. I think it's really helpful. He says, a God is the term for that which we are to look for all good, and in which we are to find refuge in all need. Therefore, to have a God is nothing else than to trust and believe in that one with your whole heart. And then he goes on and says, anything on which your heart relies and depends, I say that is really your God. So a God is just that thing you trust in over and above all other things. In fact, that's really, if you were to just take a step back and really define faith, that's really what faith is. Faith is trusting in something, right? So like when I came in here, I stood up and I came over to the microphone, and I saw this chair here. I didn't think much about it. I just sat down in the chair.
That's a bold move.
I know. Especially with me in case you're
Bold move, right? But what was I? I had faith in the chair. I trusted in the chair that the chair would hold me up. Now flip that to, I went to my son's kindergarten orientation, and they always make you sit in their chairs. And I'm looking around his classroom, and I'm looking at these chairs that are like this big, and I'm like, I'm not going to sit in that chair. Because if I sit, I don't trust this chair. Like, if I sit in this chair, it's going to be nothing but a pile of kindling under me. My son's going to come to school the next day and go, why don't I have a chair to sit in? Oh, your dad blew it up when he tried to sit in it, right? So, like, on the other side, like, it was like, I don't trust in that. But, when we trust in something, we think we can put our whole weight on it. We're like, hey, I can rest here. And so what Luther's saying is, your God is the thing you would trust in over and above everything else.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also know that I think a lot of times when we think of gods and something that we put our trust in, we think of like a being or something that like we can look at or see, but it can really be anything. We talk about Sly. It can be, your talents, the things that you're really good at, that you're like, man, I can just focus everything on this, whether it's if you're really good at your job or if you're really good at a sport or anything, just trusting those things more than anything rather than the person who gave you those talents and ability to do those things.
Yeah, that's really huge. And I love that you brought up that example because, the reality is when you really start to dig down, all people are people of faith. So that whole idea of do you have faith is actually probably the most inaccurate statement I think in existence. Everybody has faith. Everybody trusts in something or someone, and everybody has an ultimate thing they trust in. So not only does everybody have faith, everybody has a God. Everybody has something that they worship over and above everything else, something that brings them meaning. I think back to your example, like I trust in my talents, right? Do you remember that moment if you were ever like really able to pour yourself into something like a sport, right? And then you have that moment where you have your last game and you're no longer either at like a talent level where you're moving on because what is it, 0.001% end up professional athletes, right? Yeah. So chances are you hit that at some point. It might have been, maybe it was T-ball. You peaked out there. Right. Like your career was over. Maybe it was high school. Maybe it was college. But, a lot of times you'll see these professional athletes that have these like crises of identity because why? Well, their whole life they have been the football star. And now all of a sudden they're in a place where they can no longer play football. Life is moving on, but their core sense of identity has been stripped away.
Yeah, and I think you could point to any number of examples, right? Anything could qualify as a god or that thing that we look to for ultimate security, meaning, or identity. It could be a relationship with a spouse or kids. It could be money. It could be you name it. And
yeah, and I think it's another important thing to say with that is just because something is important to you doesn't mean it's like a bad thing, right? Like it's not bad to love your job and be good at your job. It's not bad to be devoted to your family and love your kids and be a good father, wife, husband, all those different things. It's not bad to focus on those things, but what we're talking about here is when you put that above the level of God in your life, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this First Commandment.
Yeah, and I think that's huge you point that out. They're not bad things. Because I think a lot of times that's the sense you get when you read through something like this. Oh, well, those are bad things. No, they're really good things.
Yeah.
In fact, they're things that God gave you. It's just when you try to hold them over and above God. And I think one of the big reasons for that is they're things that are ultimately as fragile and inconsistent as you are. And I think that's why it's such a bad place, God says, to put your hope, because these things can't bear the weight of your life. They're going to fail you. I think it's really interesting. I was reading an article in Psychology Today, Dr. Lance Dodds, and he does research on achievement and stuff like that. And he titled the article, "The Unhappy Achiever." And he says in this article, the problem is that for some people, achievement leaves them feeling empty to the core. It can make them depressed, anxious, even angry. They rarely understand why. They may not even realize their unhappiness is related to their achievement in the first place. Often, all they know is that they feel exhausted and deeply unfulfilled. Feelings that are hard to square with the success they have achieved. Isn't this supposed to be invigorating? Shouldn't each win make them want to yell, "I'm going to Disney World," like Super Bowl champs? I didn't write that, he did. And then he goes on, he says this, I thought this was clutch. He says, "These people may feel empty because of what their achievements mean to them. For complex reasons, they feel they have to achieve just to feel valuable or worthy. Achievements aren't a joy, they're a necessity. And when someone is forced to achieve just to have value, they can't stop achieving, and they stop being lovable. It's a terrible burden." And I think that's what God's hitting in these 10 Commandments. That's why he leads in with, you are the people that I brought out of Egypt, that I brought out of slavery. He's trying to show you that you're deeply, deeply loved, that you have deep value and meaning because of who God is and what he's done for you. And anything else that you try to put in there ends up being this, wheel that just goes round and round and you can never seem to get off, And it's like, hey, that next achievement wasn't enough. I think I was listening to an interesting sermon recently by Tim Keller, and he had a Madonna quote where Madonna said the exact same thing. All the things that Madonna achieved, like she's always like, I'm just looking for that next achievement, thinking that next achievement will bring me meaning and fulfillment, and it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think when it really comes down to it, all of these commandments, and you see it especially in the first commandment, is they're all simply about love and our relationship with God, right? And you hear in Scripture where it says we love because he first loved us, right? So when I think of this, I say, well, God is saying for us to fear, love, and trust in him above all things. God's calling us to love him more than anything else. And we can do that because God loved us above everything else, right? Like God put us ahead of his own needs and desires. He gave Jesus for all of us. So when it comes down to it, these commandments, all of them, first commandment through the 10th commandment, they're all about love, and they all point us to Jesus and what God did for us by sending Jesus and showing how much he loves us. So he gives us these commandments like you were talking about.
Yeah, so I think, it's really important. The peace that you're probably looking for, the security you're looking for, the sense of meaning and belonging that you're looking for, and oftentimes you're looking for in all these other places. God's saying, if you start with me, you'll find all those things you're looking for. And then as a byproduct of that, all those other things around you will have more meaning. They'll bring you more joy. They'll bring you more peace because they're not trying to hold up the weight of your identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about this, what are some maybe tangible examples you would point to of what it might look like to love God above everything else, or to trust him above everything else?
I'm struck by what Paul said in First Corinthians. And in First Corinthians, the church in Corinth was really in kind of like chaos and upheaval. After Paul left, a lot of different people were trying to lead. And at one point, Paul makes this quote that's so powerful. He says, "But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I am thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me." And so in that, it's really powerful. I think a great example of this is realizing that you don't have to derive your meaning from what other people say or even from what you say about yourself, but that your meaning comes from God, and God consistently in Scripture says, you're loved, you're forgiven, you're a precious child, you're worth dying for, kind of thing. So that for me is a really tangible example of where do I find my meaning.
Yeah, I think a struggle that I have, and probably everybody might have, whatever your job is or whatever you're doing. I mean, for us, it might be we stand up and talk in front of people a lot, or I play music in front of people a lot, or whether you're giving presentations or whatever it is at your job, we can kind of see that as, man, we have to like perform for someone, and if we don't do it exactly the right way at the exactly like right time and everything's perfect, like I'm gonna be a failure, like it's not gonna work out very well, like people are gonna judge me, like what you just talked about. So like for me personally, like when I stand up and play music, like if I'm thinking about that, like my mind is just like wandering like all over the place. And after worship, which is most of the time where I'm playing music, like I'm not focusing on, man, like I just praised God. Like I'm focusing on like, man, did I hit that like right chord, or like did anybody hear when I like missed that note? Like things like that, as opposed to, man, God gave me this talent to do this, and this is just praising him for that. And if I put him first and love him above what I think other people think of me, like it just makes life so much easier.
Yeah, that's cool. And I think for me, a lot of it comes down to is who do you go to first, or where do you go to first? Like, for example, when something terrible happens, when it feels like a piece of your life is crumbling, where do you go? Where do you look to try to like prop yourself up? And I'm the kind of person that might look to things like performance or achievement. or my own good deeds or righteousness. And there are times where I've tried to prop myself up by those things and realized that can't really get it done. So in those moments where I'm in need of some security or some shelter, if I want to find something that truly lasts, running to God's word and hearing what his voice has to say rather than the own voices in my head or the voices from outside in the world, or running to God in prayer with the bad stuff and with the good stuff. So for me, those are just a couple small examples of what it might look like in my own life.
Yeah, and I think too, just keep in mind that, it doesn't mean you don't need any other relationships. It doesn't mean that you don't need to work hard at whatever it is that God's given you to do, or, but rather it gets to take the weight off of those things being your central purpose and meaning in life. And then you get to enjoy those things more, like you guys are saying, which I love.
Yeah, and I think just something to focus on and understand, especially as we start talking about the commandments even more, is we can almost put the pressure of keeping the commandments as our God sometimes, right? Like we can think, like, okay, like I have to spend all of my time like figuring out how to fear, love, trust in God above all things. Like this is what I'm going to focus my entire life on. But the reality is, and we'll talk about this throughout the fundamentals of faith, is that we're born with sin inside of us. And unfortunately, no matter how hard we try to fear, love, and trust in God above all things, like sometimes we're going to mess up.
Yep.
We're going to mess up, the three of us. Everybody's going to mess up at doing that. So it might seem like, okay, like, man, so what do I do? If I can't follow these perfectly all the time, but God's telling me to follow these, like, where's the hope in that?
Yeah, and I think that's where you jump back into you're loved, you're forgiven, you're already a child. It's like my kids. I know they're gonna mess it up. I know that they're not gonna do things perfectly, but I'm gonna encourage them when they do it well. And in some moments, I'm just gonna remind them, hey, you're just learning how to live life, and you're still my loved child. Like you haven't gone anywhere. Like you're still a child. And so I think a purely practical thing you can do to kind of keep God as God is get a list of a few Bible verses where God just speaks his love into you. Verses like John 3:16, 17, for God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever should believe in him would have eternal life. He did not come to the world to condemn the world, but the world might have life in him. Where Paul says, in Romans, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are God's children. Like any verse that's going to talk about what God has done for you, not what you're supposed to do for God, but what God has done for you is a great thing. And if you put those just around you, places you can see, find some spots where you can kind of like think about them, read them, those will be things that'll help you keep God as God. Cool stuff. Well, hey guys, thanks for taking time on this fundamental series. We got more coming at you. Obviously, we have 9 more commandments we're going to dig into. So if you like what you're seeing here, please stay tuned. Feel free to rate us on whatever podcast platform you're listening to it on. And then also you can follow us on YouTube. Click subscribe, and that's a great way to follow fundamentals of the faith. And feel free to share this with somebody else, whether it's another person that's trying to learn how to live the life of Jesus in their everyday life, or somebody that just has a lot of questions about Christianity or wants to learn more about faith. This is a great place to point them, so feel free to share that with them. So till next time, we're looking forward to hanging out with you right here on Fundamentals of the Faith.